All right, good evening. We are very excited to have the opportunity to have a budget town hall. My name is Heath Morrison. I'm the very proud superintendent of Montgomery ISD, and we have many, many things that we are responsible for in our school district. And while we have many priorities, there are really three that are of the utmost importance. How well we educate all of our students, how well we keep our students and staff safe, and then how we are good fiduciary officers of the taxpayer dollars to make sure that we do those first two priorities exceptionally well. So while our Board of Trustees has many, many decisions that they have to make during the course of a year, one of the more important decisions that they have to make every year is the approval of our operating budget. A lot of school districts talk about what they're trying to accomplish. They talk about their goals and their dreams and their things that they want to do on behalf of all schools and all children. But really, it is the budget that shows the priorities and the actionable items that will determine how well those priorities will ultimately unfold. In Montgomery ISD, everything that we do, we try to do process-driven, and we have a very robust process for developing our operating budget. And everything we do in Montgomery ISD, we do with great transparency and collaboration. So as we work on our operating budget this year, we have several opportunities for the community to engage, either in person or online, to help give us guidance, suggestions, ideas, feedback about how and ultimately to create the best budget that will work for all students, all schools in Montgomery ISD when we present it to our Board of Trustees. Speaking about our Board of Trustees, I want to recognize that we have several in our audience tonight. We have Dr. Matt Fuller, our Board President. We have Ms. Lori Turner. We have Sean Dennison. And we have candidate for the board, Mr. Nate Robb. So we're very grateful for our board members and board candidates. But we're going to go ahead and get the show on the road. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, our Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations, Mr. Chris Lynn.
Good evening. As Dr. Morrison said, this is the first of two budget town halls for this budget season. So tonight, we're going to spend our time talking about Budget 101 and kind of sharing some information about how the district receives money and the process that we utilize to create the annual budget. So tonight, we're going to talk about budget basics, budget development, cover revenues, expenditures, and then finish with some information about tax rates. So, we all know that a budget is an allocation of resources to meet the prioritized needs of an organizational unit, but often we get the question, why is this budget so important? The budget actually is, provides the funding for that educational and or operational plan. So it is extremely important to make sure that we have a thoughtful process that lays out what our educational plans and departmental plans are for the district. Just a few budget basics. Actually, required by state law, the superintendent is required to prepare the budget annually, and that budget must be prepared either by June 19th or August 20th, depending on the district's fiscal year. Here in Montgomery ISD, our fiscal year runs July 1 through June 30, so our budget must be prepared no later than June 19th. That budget must be adopted by our Board of Trustees, and actually they are required to adopt three budgets, the general fund, the nutrition, and the debt service fund. The board does have the authority to amend those budgets throughout the year. And just some language, sometimes finance people as myself, we get caught up in our language, but just a reminder, when revenues are greater than expenditures, it's a budget surplus. That's a good thing. Sometimes expenditures are greater than our revenues, which means it's a budget deficit. Not necessarily a bad thing as long as you plan for it going ahead, but obviously we like to have a budget surplus, not the deficit. So, let's talk about budget development, and this really should be a process, not one single event. And so as we're here tonight, educating the community and getting input, this is part of our budget process that actually started back in December. And so what I've done is just pull a few of the key time points throughout this budget process. Last month, the Board of Trustees actually had a workshop, and we presented compensation data to them about how Montgomery ISD compares with our surrounding districts. Because, as we'll talk about later, the largest portion of the district's annual budget goes to payroll, salaries, benefits, and how many employees that we have throughout the district. Also in February, I was charged with making sure that we developed our preliminary revenue estimates for next fiscal year, because we have to know how much money we're planning to have before we start that budget process. In March, our senior leadership team is working on creating next year's enrollment projections at each one of our campuses. We're also looking at campus and departmental staffing levels and what needs our campuses and departments have. And we'll be finalizing our compensation plan, because at the April board meeting, we will be recommending the 22-23 compensation plan to our Board of Trustees and asking them to approve that. After that, since that is the largest portion of our budget, we're able to distribute departmental and campus budget worksheets, and then their work begins on the budget. And once again, they should be engaging with their campus level planning teams and their campus-based staff to determine what the educational needs of their campuses are. In May, we will present the preliminary budget to our Board of Trustees, and then actually in June is when they adopt the 22-23 official budget. So in order to have a budget, you need some money. So in Texas, school districts get their money from three sources: federal, state, and local. Here in Montgomery ISD, federal only makes up 2% of our overall general fund budget, so that is the smallest percentage, while local sources make up almost 85% of our annual budget. So federal funding is normally appropriated for special programs or to provide services to specific groups of students. It cannot be supplanted, meaning it cannot be used to replace state or local dollars. About half of federal funds go directly to districts, and the remainder goes to the state. Some of the most prominent federal money that you've heard about in the news lately is the ESSER money. Just to be clear, MISD only received about $4 million of ESSER money, while several of our surrounding districts receive significantly more than that. So when people ask why maybe we're not able to do some of the things our surrounding district is doing, a lot of them are using some ESSER money to accomplish some of those tasks that we just don't have at this point. State funding, obviously administered by TEA. The overall purpose of the state funds is meant to ensure that all school districts, regardless of their property wealth, receive substantially equal access to similar revenue per student at similar tax effort. That's a fancy way to say the state system is extremely complicated. It's very hard to explain. It's based on property values, average daily attendance, enrollments in special programs such as career and technical education, special education, at-risk, and bilingual, just to name a few. Local funding, as I said, that is the majority of our local budget, comes from local sources. It's generated from property taxes, investment income, rental fees, athletic activities, tuition. The most important thing to remember is that the Montgomery Central Appraisal District is the entity responsible for setting property values, not the MISD Board of Trustees. And those are called ad valorem taxes. Property taxes account for anywhere between 75 to 87% of our local revenue. And after the passage of House Bill 3, the M&O tax rate is actually compressed as property values increase. And so here's a chart depicting the MISD tax rate. And as you can see, the current MISD tax rate is the lowest that it has been since 2005 and 2006. So you can see starting in 1920 with the passage of House Bill 3, every year since then, our tax rate has been compressed and has actually decreased. Just to give you an idea, here was the revenue summary for the 21-22 budget. And so we break it down between local, state, and federal. So you can see all of the different categories in the local. It's about $67.3 million, a little over $10 million in state, and roughly $1.4 million in federal sources, and given us a total of almost just under $80 million to work with for the 21-22 school year. So when we focus on the expenditure side, we have a number of big buckets that we have our expenditures in. We have salaries, professional services, supplies and materials, travel and miscellaneous, but we also have a number of program-specific expenditures, and those relate to specific programs such as gifted and talented, career and tech, comp ed, bilingual. And so we track all of these expenditures according to the funding formulas and the formulas presented by TEA. So this is the 21-22 adopted budget. You can see $79.3 million worth of expenditures. Just so the community knows that when this budget was adopted, it was a balanced budget. It was actually a surplus budget, meaning we had more in revenues than we had in expenses. And that is always our plan and our commitment to this board to bring them a balanced budget. So as we look at our expenditures, you can see here roughly 80% of our budget is for salary and benefits, which is by far the largest piece. And then when we break it down by function, I don't know why these slides are not looking the right way, but about 61% of our expenditures are spent specifically on instruction. Tax rates. I don't know what happened there, but tax rates. When we talk about tax rates, we've got basically two buckets. And when after the board adopts the budget, a couple of months later, they are asked to adopt the tax rate. We've got the maintenance and operations, which is also known as the general fund, and we have the interest and sinking, which is also known as debt service. So the maintenance and operations provides for our daily operations, just like it sounds. This is where we pay the salaries for our teacher and other staff, all of our maintenance, our fuel, our supplies, our utilities. For the average citizen, this is similar to house repairs, car fuel, groceries, everything that you need to operate your household. The interest and sinking fund is what we use to repay debt for those big ticket items. So new building construction, renovations, land purchase. And so for the average citizen, that equates to that new home purchase or new appliances, that new car that you want. Here in a few minutes, we're going to introduce you to the 2022 Bond Referendum, in case you haven't heard about that. But what a bond is a debt investment similar to a mortgage. And so what we would be doing is looking for an investor. We would sell bonds, they would give us money, and that allows us to fund those projects and make those projects come to fruition. We use bonds, once again, to pay for those big ticket items, new facilities, renovations, land purchases, school buses, technology, all of those things that we'll cover with you here in just a minute. It's important to know, once again, on the M&O side, 80% of the school district's budget goes to support personnel salaries and related costs. So after salaries, after utilities, all of those things that we're required to do in order to have school, there's very limited resources left to do a lot of additional things. On the INS side, one important thing to note as we talk about the bond here in a few minutes, INS money or bond money cannot be used for salaries, utilities, or other day-to-day expenses. So the bond projects that we will discuss in a minute are the things that we can use that bond money on. We cannot give our employees a pay raise, or we cannot go hire a bunch of additional employees with that bond money. The current tax rate in Montgomery ISD is $1.26. And as we showed you just a minute ago, that tax rate has decreased over the last few years. So I know that was a quick Budget 101 introduction. Just wanted to kind of introduce some topics. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any right now about the budget. Otherwise, we're going to move into bond conversations. All right.
Thank you, Chris. So as we are going through our operating budget process this year, what's complicating and also important is for us to be able to articulate and differentiate what's happening with the creation of our operating budget and what is happening with the bond election that our Board of Trustees has called. As Chris just said in the overview of our Budget 101, it's very clear. We can use operating dollars if we have capital needs. We cannot use the monies derived from the bond for operating needs. And so it's just really important, but it's a good opportunity for us to be able to not only talk about the operating budget and what we're trying to focus on this year, but also to talk about the bond that the Board of Trustees called for in their last meeting in February. So the board, as they do with everything, takes a great deal of data. They take thoughtful deliberation in all of their decisions, and they certainly did that with the decision to call for a bond. The decision they reached in February of this year actually started last year, hiring a brand new superintendent, coming in doing an entry plan, hearing all the things that were great about our district and the things that needed to be better. And as we went along that journey, we evolved into creating a brand new strategic plan. We did that with really unprecedented community input. Over 400 individuals helped us with that plan. And that plan not only talked about academic and instructional program needs, but then suggested some opportunities that may need the consideration of a bond. At the same time as we were developing the new strategic plan, we were also presenting other data to the district Board of Trustees. One of the most important things that a Board of Trustees has to ask of staff is, are we a growing school district? Are we a declining school district in enrollment, or are we basically staying flat? If we are a district that is declining, then there are challenging discussions to have with the community because you have a loss of those state and local resources, and ultimately, potentially, you have to start thinking about shutting schools. Never an easy conversation for any community to engage in. If you are staying flat in student enrollment, it comes with some challenges and some opportunities, as it does if you are growing. Obviously, more resources come with a growing student enrollment, and that's a good thing. But then you have to ask the question, do we have a sufficient number of schools to accommodate the growing population of students? And so we went out, we got a third-party PASA to do a demographic study, and a little advance hit, it did show that we are growing and growing quickly. Additionally, we wanted to do a facilities assessment. That facilities assessment was, again, done by a third party. That facilities assessment looked at every single one of our campuses, all of our buildings owned by Montgomery ISD, to look at were they where they needed to be to educate our kids well, make sure that it's cool in the buildings when it's hot outside, and warm in the buildings when it's cold outside. And so that facilities assessment was done, and as was the demographic study, all those reports were presented to the board in the spring, put on our website under transparency for anyone to look at and to be informed. All of those things, the strategic plan, the facilities assessment, the demographic study, led our board to come to an important request of staff, which was to convene a bond task force. And they did that in the fall. That bond task force was representative of our community, over 60 individuals. We had employees, teachers, and support staff. We had parents, we had students, we had business, faith-based community leaders. We had bears, we had lions, we had people that were really excited about the potential of a bond, and we had people that were not there yet and needed to be convinced before they recommended a bond to our Board of Trustees. So this group met, and the first thing they looked at was a demographic study. The demographic study, what's interesting is when PASA started this work last year, we had not yet reached 9,000 students. Today, as we are here at this budget workshop, budget town hall, we are closing in on 9,500 students. And the demographic study did show that over the next several years up to the year 2030, we were going to be closing in on about 14,000 students. And so they predicted growth, and they predicted that growth would be coming very quickly. We are experiencing growth all over our school district in all of our schools, some faster than others. So, for example, Lake Creek High School in the demographic study was not suggested to have reached max capacity until 2025. It reached max capacity this year. Keenan Elementary School was not predicted to reach max capacity until 2025, and we know it will reach max capacity next year. So the growth is not only coming, it is here. And so the Bond Task Force looked at that. They also looked at the facilities assessment. And again, this facilities assessment looked at all of the things that are important in the building and in terms of making sure we have great learning environments for our students. We try to take great care of our schools, just like you take great care of your house. But about every 20 years, you need to put a new roof on your home. You need to, about every 14 years, put a new hot water heater in. And those things happen in a school district as well, except they are very expensive and challenging to do in just our operating budget. And so the facilities assessment looked at all of our schools and identified over $70 million of need, and as you would imagine, more skewed to our older campuses. But even at Lake Creek High School, there were needs that were identified, a lot of them around technology and technology infrastructure. The Bond Task Force really started their work in around October. They did their homework. They asked staff a lot of questions. They reviewed all of these data, and they made a decision that consensus would be reached at 66%. And one of the first decisions that they made as a group was that they had seen enough to know they were going to call for a bond and make that recommendation to the Board of Trustees. Then every single project, with the exception of one, that is being presented and the board considered, did reach that 66% threshold or actually exceed it. And to do a very quick summary of what is in the bond proposal, I'm going to ask Chris Lynn to come back up.
All right, so the task force was really focused on three primary areas: growth, facility upgrades, and an emphasis on career and technical education opportunities. So when we talk about growth, the first project is construction of new elementary school number 7, a roughly 900 student capacity elementary, similar to Keenan Elementary, to alleviate the overcrowding at Keenan and Stewart Creek Elementaries. As Dr. Morrison said, Lake Creek High School is currently over capacity, so there is an addition to Lake Creek High School, a 900 student addition that will provide additional classrooms, science labs, and the other spaces that Lake Creek High School needs to meet that additional student growth. Unfortunately, the district currently does not own any additional land for Elementary 7, for Junior High 3, or for any of our CTE facilities. So the task force recommended $15 million to provide funding for the purchase of those sites. Junior High number 3 was one of the items that the task force struggled with. The demographic study showed that we need the third junior high around year 2030. However, in today's dollars, it's about $100 million for the construction of junior high number 3. And so that was a lot to put into this bond with all of the other needs. But they did want to be extremely thoughtful about planning for junior high number 3. So the land, remember, for junior high 3 is part of that $15 million, and then there's an additional $6 million to go ahead and do the pre-construction services or the design for junior high number 3. $6.3 million for buses. We currently have 35 buses that are at or beyond their useful life, so we need to replace those and provide additional buses to meet the increasing student enrollment. $5.4 million for technology devices. This was something that the task force was very focused on, making sure that all of our classrooms had an appropriate and enough technology in their classrooms. So at the elementary school, we're talking about class sets. At the lower grade levels, those may look like iPads. The higher elementary grades, those may be Chromebooks or laptops. At the secondary level, it's more of a one-to-one type initiative focused around Chromebooks and or laptops. One of the areas that the task force was focused on was making sure that each one of our facilities was upgraded. So $75 million to touch every single campus and every single facility in Montgomery ISD. And these are the items, they're not sexy, but they are absolutely necessary to making sure that our buildings perform like they're supposed to. So lighting upgrades, plumbing, HVAC, roofs, things that have to be done due to updated code requirements. We talked about technology devices a second ago. $21 million for the infrastructure to make sure that those devices work properly. So every single classroom in Montgomery ISD will benefit from this technology infrastructure. So cabling, Wi-Fi, replacement of panels, instructional panels that are at the front of the classroom. Safety and security, a little over $5 million. The last bond did a really good job of creating secure vestibules and making sure that our visitors have a point to check in without just gaining access to the campus. This $5 million will be focused on adding security cameras, replacing outdated security cameras, making sure that our burglar alarms are appropriate, fencing, vape detectors, everything else that we need to make sure that our buildings are as safe and secure as they can be. $8.6 million for transportation facility renovations. We have 2 transportation facilities here in the district. Comparability. This was an interesting topic that we discovered or explored during our task force meetings, wanting to make sure that each one of the facilities in MISD meets our standard. We want to be clear, and we've tried to be consistent on this point through all of our conversations. Our facilities across the district will never be equal. They have been built at different times in the history of the district using different construction methods, but every one of our facilities should be comparable. They should meet our MISD standards. And so this $15 million goes to make sure that that happens. At the elementary level, we're talking about playground equipment. We're talking about shade structures. We're talking about replacing outdated cafeteria tables, outdated classroom furniture. At the secondary level, we're talking about a significant emphasis on fine arts. So choir, band, theater, making sure that all of those programs have comparable facilities across the district. And then we get into athletics. So $8.5 million for the renovation and expansion of the athletic complex. So additional seating capacity, additional restrooms, concession stands, locker rooms, renovation of the press box, elevator, and replacement of the artificial turf. At Montgomery High School, replacing of the lights at the auxiliary stadium and resurfacing of the tennis courts, covering the batting cages here at Lake Creek High School, and then at both high schools, installation of artificial turf for the competition baseball and softball fields. And then we get to what is really kind of the crown jewel of this bond referendum, and that is this Centralized Cte Center. Early on in the task force discussions, they rallied around this idea that we want to do more around career and technical education. And so this center will allow us to expand our CTE offerings, such as automotive and cosmetology programs that we're not able to offer now because of space limitations. Making sure that those programs have state-of-the-art lab and shop spaces so that our students, as they start their CTE exploration at each one of the high schools, once they continue that and really start diving into each one of those programs, they have state-of-the-art facilities in this CTE center. Dr. Morrison alluded to a 66% threshold. The one project in this whole package that did not meet 66% was the Centralized Ag Science Center, okay? There was 100% agreement among the task force that they wanted to do something significant for ag. The debate was how best to accomplish that. Was that to be done through an ag barn for each high school, or was that to be done through a centralized facility? At the end of the day, 57% of the task force recommended that that be a centralized center, and they asked the board to make that final decision. So as you see it here, the board has recommended a centralized ag science center. This will be everything that you would normally see in an ag barn, so your pens, your wash bays, your exercise areas. But this will also include a show arena and then also instructional spaces for the vet tech classes. So it is more than just an ag barn, but it does become an instructional space as well. So when you go to the polls to vote, either in early voting or on election day, you're going to see three propositions. These three propositions does not mean that some projects or programs are favored more than others. Proposition B, which is the athletic complex, and Proposition C, the technology devices, are required to be separate propositions by state law. All of the other projects will be included in Prop A, and it's also important to note that these propositions are not in competition with each other. So when you go into the ballot, into the voting box, you do not have to pick just one. You can pick one, you can pick two, you can select all three. They are not in competition with each other. As we talked about just a minute ago in our budget town hall, we realized that nobody likes to pay additional property taxes. But the MISD tax rate is at its lowest level since 2005-2006. In order to pay for this bond, we are asking the community for a slight increase in the INS tax rate. We're asking for less than 1 penny on that tax rate. So 0.7 of 1 cent is what we are asking for. The average home in Montgomery ISD is valued at $350,000, and that equates to $22.75 per year on that average home in Montgomery ISD. So less than $2 a month is the financial impact on that average home. Any of our taxpayers who are over 65 and have a homestead exemption are exempt and will feel no impact from this bond referendum. Also on the ballot, there will be a state constitutional amendment asking if you want your homestead exemption to increase. The current homestead exemption amount is $25,000. The state is asking, do you want to see that increase to $40,000? Every other time this has been on the ballot in the state of Texas, the voters have said yes. So should that pass and should this bond pass, that impact on that $350,000 home, that homeowner will actually see a decrease of $167.30, even if this bond were to pass. So, our communications department has done a phenomenal job of getting information out to our community, but should you have questions or should you want to see some information, information is available on our website at misd.org/bond. There's a ton of resources there. Also important to note that the deadline to register to vote is April the 7th. Early voting will begin April 25th, and Election Day is Saturday, May the 7th. So, Dr. Morrison, any comments?
Just to kind of culminate the conversation, the creation of our school district budget is a lot like the creation of your household budget. You have to say how much money's coming in, and you have to say what are the things we have to have, what are the things we'd like to have, and then every once in a while you hope to get some of the things you'd love to have. And then because you have your revenues coming in, and usually the purchase of a home exceeds what you can do just out of your, at one time, with your income coming in, you usually have to go out and get a mortgage. And so this process for our school district is much like a home. The bond kind of functions like a mortgage, and the creation of our operating budget is very much like you do at home. We have to say how much revenue, federal, local, state, is coming in, what are the immediate needs of our school district, and then we then say, can we cover all the things we have to do? Can we do some of the things we'd like to do? And are there some things we'd love to do? And we will be able to identify those better hearing from our public. So this is the time either with the operating budget portion or bond. If anyone has any questions. Justin, have we gotten any online questions? Just tell me and I'll repeat it. So.
Will teacher raises be prioritized again in this year's budget?
Okay. Great question. So the first question for those listening at home, will teacher raises be included in this year's budget? As we are going through and as we are preparing the budget, I reflect on my coming into this district last year. When I asked the question, what is great about our district, people had a lot to say, but it didn't matter what school, what community group I was talking to, I heard over and over, the best thing about our school district are our kids and our employees. And as our public talked about our employees, when I asked, well, what can we do better? They said, pay these people because we don't want them to leave Montgomery ISD to go anywhere else. And so as we looked last year, we had noticed that over the last several years, there was a gap that had started to widen between what we were compensating our employees and our teachers versus what our regional school districts were paying. So we put a lot of emphasis in last year's operating budget. That was the highest priority. I was very public that that was the highest priority, and that was at the ushering of my board of trustees, who also said it was their highest priority. We did 2 pay raises for our employees last year. We did a 2% in October, and then we came back with a 5% raise for teachers and a 3% raise on top of that for other employees. And as we have looked now at the data, we did, in fact, give the highest pay raises for teachers around the surrounding areas, and we made up a significant portion of that gap. However, we still have some ways to go. So as we are working on this budget, as we are developing those priorities, one of the highest priorities I will have is to make sure that we are continuing to focus on compensation for our awesome teachers and for all of our employees here at Montgomery ISD. So the answer is yes.
One more. If voters were to approve the bond, which projects would be the first to break ground?
So that's always one of the questions that we get dealing with the bond. It's important for our community to know that we've talked about a lot of projects. However, these projects have not been designed fully at this point. So it will take just a little bit before you actually see ground being broken. But once that occurs, obviously the addition to Lake Creek High School, since they're over capacity, and elementary number 7 are the 2 first growth projects to hit the ground. Also, we'll be looking at the renovation projects. We'll start working on a lot of stuff, assuming the community votes and allows us that privilege. Lake Creek Elementary School number 7 would be the top 2 growth projects that you would see first.
Just to add to that, people will say, well, why don't you just do it all at once? Well, the capacity to do it all at once and do it well would be challenged. And also, it is best for our community and the tax rate to be thoughtful about the sale of those bonds and to schedule them so we're only asking for the money when we know we're ready to start the project. So that's very important to us. Questions? All right. So what are next steps? We are going to continue our work as staff. We've been going out to all of our schools to talk about the bond election that was called. We will, after break, be going back out to our schools to get input from our employees on their wishes and hopes and dreams for our operating budget. We will be doing surveys, and we will have another budget town hall in Montgomery High School. Do we have the date for that? Early April, and we'll get that communicated to our community. By that time that we have our next budget town hall in early April, we'll have a very clear snapshot of what we do in fact expect the anticipated revenues to be. We'll have a better look at expenditures. We will start to share the priorities that have started to emerge, and we will once again seek enormous community input into the development of our budget. I say this all the time. We are a public education system, which means we are better when we are listening, engaging, and collaborating with our public. The bond task force, I think, really shows how much we do try to listen. As staff, we work really hard to do our homework and be ready for board meetings, and thinking if there was good potential of a bond being called, we started thinking about what might be on there and what were the needs as we saw them. And what's interesting is we still have that list. And from that list, from what we were thinking versus what the bond task force ultimately recommended, there are only 2 projects that are exactly the way we envisioned them that made it, and that was the additional Lake Creek High School and the need for elementary 7. every other project that is in this bond proposal that came from our bond task force was added, modified, changed, altered, and really made better because of their active involvement and collaboration. And that sort of partnership, that sort of input is also needed as we create the operating budget for Montgomery ISD. Whether you're here in person here at Lake Creek High School for this, whether you are online, we thank you. We look forward to listening. We look forward to getting more input, and wish everyone safe travels and an amazing spring break. Thank you so much.